They called them flying coffins, with a smirk at first, and then with dread. The nickname wasn't official. It wasn't printed in manuals or stenciled on fuselages. It was whispered by the men who flew them, passed around in mess halls, written in the corners of letters home, a black joke, half superstition, half confession. Because once you stepped inside a B-17 or B-24 in the early days of the war, you were gambling with everything you had. And the odds weren't good. At first, the Germans laughed. The Luftwaffe's fighter pilots, veterans of the Blitzkrieg and the Battle of Britain, looked at the formations of slow, lumbering American bombers with open disdain. They were massive targets, too large to miss, too slow to run, and their gunner teams, untrained, underprepared, and under no illusion of what they were walking into. To the Axis, it looked like desperation, arrogant, mechanical, hopeless desperation. But the Germans didn't understand what was coming, not just in firepower, but in spirit. This is Ghosts of WWII, where we remember the moments history tried to forget. If you've ever stood beneath the shadow of a warbird or heard a veteran speak with quiet pride of the boys in the air, subscribe and share their name in the comments below. Because this one's for them. By the winter of 1942, the U.S. Army Air Forces had begun daylight bombing raids over Europe, a tactic dismissed as suicide by the British, who had long switched to night operations, but the Americans believed in precision. They believed that with enough aircraft, enough guns, and enough resolve, they could cripple Germany's industrial heart without sacrificing their own cities to carpet bombing campaigns. The strategy was bold and costly. Early missions over France and the Low Countries returned with heavy losses. Squadrons of B-17 flying fortresses were shredded by German flak and swarms of Bf-109. The B-24 Liberators fared no better. Their range was longer, but their durability was thinner. Sometimes entire crews disappeared. No parachutes, no signals, just gone. Commanders knew the statistics. So did the airmen. But they went anyway. Because that's what courage looked like then. Walking out onto the tarmac, strapping into a steel tube filled with fuel and bombs, and flying into the teeth of a nation that had already devoured half a continent. Inside the aircraft, it was chaos in slow motion. You could smell the oil. The cold bit into your skin. The engines roared so loud that speaking became shouting. Frost crept along the windows. At altitude, oxygen masks fogged up. Fingers froze to metal. And always, always the fear of flak bursting through the fuselage, of enemy fighters punching through the defensive ring, of fire, smoke, and the long fall home, or nowhere at all. There were stories of gunners who kept firing with shrapnel in their lungs, of pilots who held the stick with one arm while the other hung limp from a bullet, of navigators who plotted routes through blood on their charts. One such crew, the men of the Hell's Tithe, a B-17 from the 100th Bomb Group, flew 17 missions over enemy territory. On the 18th, they were hit over Bremen, engines gone. Wings sheared. The pilot held her steady long enough for 6 men to bail out. He and the co-pilot stayed behind. The wreckage was found years later, embedded in a forest. The controls were still gripped in skeletal hands. Back then, you needed 25 missions to rotate home. Most never made it past 10, and yet they kept going. Why? Not for glory, not for medals, for each other. Because every mission was a promise. If one bomber went down, the others would mark the spot. If someone parachuted, someone else would radio their position. If a plane made it back limping, the ground crews worked through the night to get it flying again, because tomorrow it had to go back. The turning point came in 1943. That year, the Americans launched Operation Point Blank, a massive strategic bombing campaign aimed at destroying the German aircraft industry Schweinfurt, Regensburg, Stuttgart. names that would become carved in the memories of airmen who survived, and ghosts for those who didn't. Schweinfurt was a slaughter. 60 bombers lost in one raid. Hundreds of men killed or captured. The Luftwaffe threw everything they had, and it worked. For a moment, it looked like the gamble had failed, but then came the evolution. Tactics improved. Fighter escorts, first the P-47 Thunderbolts, then the long-range P-51 Mustangs, began accompanying bomber formations deep into German airspace. The B-17 crews refined their defensive fire patterns. Gunners trained harder, radios improved, engines were reinforced, and most of all, they learned. They learned where the flak batteries hid, how the German fighters approached, when to duck, when to fire, when to pray. And somewhere in that crucible of smoke and ice and flame, the flying coffin became something else. It became a hammer, not a desperate weapon, but a deliberate one, forged in blood, wielded with precision. The Germans stopped laughing. By 1944, the flying coffins no longer looked like jokes. They looked like thunderclouds. Massive bomber formations, once considered suicidal, now darkened the skies in waves. Hundreds of aircraft flying in tight boxes, wingtip to wingtip, guns bristling from every angle. Their roar shook the ground. Their shadows stretched for miles. And inside, the men were no longer rookies. They were veterans. They still carried fear. Fear never left. But it had been honed into something harder, something useful. They moved through pre-flight checks with muscle memory. They scanned the skies with eyes that had seen friends vanish in flames. And when they rolled down those runways, they did it with a quiet resolve that can't be taught, only earned. But the danger never eased. Every flight over Germany meant dodging flak bursts the size of small cars. The air itself could tear a plane apart. Fighters still swarmed, now with FW-190s and ME-262 jets in the mix. Even with the Mustang escorts, the enemy didn't go quietly. And when the guns ran dry, it was up to grit. One crew out of the 395th Bomb Group took a direct flak hit over Leipzig. Half their tail was gone. Their hydraulic systems failed, but the pilot refused to bail out. He made a dead-stick landing in a Belgian field, sliding over wet grass, sparks flying. When the medics pulled him from the cockpit, his boots had melted to the rudder pedals. He'd flown the last 40 miles with his feet on fire. These were the kinds of men who filled the flying coffins. Not cowards, not fools, but professionals shaped by trial and loss. They wrote letters home. They carried photos of wives and sweethearts in their jacket pockets. Some carved names into the buttstocks of their .50 cals. Some prayed. Most didn't, not because they didn't believe, but because they'd already made peace. Each mission was a wager, and yet they strapped in. One mechanic, interviewed decades later, said, "They came back with holes in the wings you could crawl through, engines shot to pieces, but the crews climbed out smiling, sometimes limping but smiling because they made it back. And the guy next to them did too. They weren't just bombing factories, they were rewriting the rules." Before the Americans arrived, the Luftwaffe owned the skies. German industry ran on overtime. Rail lines carried tanks and munitions uninterrupted. By mid-1944, that had changed. Precision raids crippled ball-bearing production in Schweinfurt, slowed tank assembly in Kassel, and shut down synthetic fuel plants in Leuna rail hubs were demolished. Refineries burned. The German war machine began to stall, not from lack of will, but lack of parts. Every successful mission was a dent in the axis, a crack in the armor, but at a cost. Losses remained high. Some days, entire groups failed to return. And yet, the bombers kept flying. Even after D-Day, even as the Allies pushed into France, the air war did not relent. The skies were the battlefield behind the battlefield, invisible to most ground troops, but crucial to every advance. And it wasn't just men fighting now. Technology evolved with them. B-17S received upgrades, improved gun sights, armor plating, even primitive radar systems. Crews developed hand signals and code words to coordinate fire. Some carried homemade good luck charms, rabbit feet, crucifixes, even small American flags sewn into uniform cuffs. But for all the tools, nothing mattered more than the man beside you. One tail gunner described it this way: "I didn't care about Berlin or Hitler or even winning. I cared about the guy in the waist gun. I made sure he lived. He made sure I did. That's what got us through." That bond, forged in the freezing altitudes, stitched together with fear and sweat and gunpowder, was stronger than anything else. And slowly, a reputation grew. The Germans stopped mocking. Their fighter pilots began requesting transfers away from bomber interception duty. They called the formations murder walls, flying traps of interlocking fire. Some Luftwaffe units began developing new tactics, head-on attacks, coordinated flak corridors, even explosive-laden planes. Desperation was setting in, because for every bomber they brought down, 5 more arrived. The Americans weren't stopping. And then, in early 1945, came the culmination: Dresden. Controversial, devastating, still debated today. But regardless of where you stand on the ethics, one thing is clear: the bombing campaign had reached its peak. The skies over Germany belonged to the Allies. The Coffins no longer flew defensively. They dictated terms. The men inside them had transformed, no longer mocked, no longer doubted. They had earned their place. By the final months of the war, the skies above Europe had shifted. What once was a death trap for Allied bombers had become a corridor of firepower. B-17 and B-24s no longer snuck in. They announced themselves. The drone of their engines echoed across cities and valleys long before the bombs fell. And for those on the ground in Germany, the sound didn't bring mockery anymore. It brought dread. But inside those bombers, things had changed too. The crews were tired, not just physically, but spiritually. For those who had survived the early missions, every new sortie felt like gambling with house money. They shouldn't have made it this far. And yet, they strapped in again and again, knowing full well their luck could end at 25, 30, 34 missions. They flew anyway, because by now they were not just airmen, they were avengers. They had lost friends, watched their squadron shrink, seen empty chairs at briefings, folded flags, telegrams. Each mission now carried something heavier than bombs, a personal weight. Some wrote the names of fallen crewmates on the nose of the plane. Some refused to let anyone else sit in their friend's turret. Some became quiet, haunted men, not from cowardice, but from carrying too many ghosts. The cockpit wasn't just a place of action anymore. It became a confessional. Gunners whispered apologies to the dead. Pilots muttered prayers. Flight engineers ran checklists like rituals, afraid that forgetting one line might cost the whole crew. And yet, in all this, there was pride. Because they knew now what the world hadn't known at the start. The bombers were working. Rail yards were in rubble. Oil fields burned for days. Factories shut down. Bridges collapsed. The Nazi war machine was choking, not from tanks, not from infantry, but from the sky. It was death by disruption. The German people, once told the Reich was invincible, began to question, to fear, to falter. And behind every disrupted supply line, every delayed division, every grounded Luftwaffe squadron, was a B-17 or a B-24 that had flown through hell to get there. The flying coffins, once mocked, had become the scalpel of Allied strategy, but the cost never left. Some missions didn't even make it to the drop. One crew, flying out of RAF Thorpe Abbotts, was hit before they reached the channel. Flak over the coast punched through their wing. 2 engines caught fire. The pilot refused to ditch. He turned the plane around, feathered the engines, and glided her back toward England. They crash-landed in a sheep pasture. Every man survived. The tail gunner would later say, "I thought we were dead. We were. For 3 minutes, we were ghosts. But somehow, we came back." Stories like that filled the lockers and bunks of every air base in England, not to scare, but to remind them why they flew and how lucky they were to return. When new recruits arrived, they were quiet, eyes wide, looking at the older crews with reverence and fear. The veterans carried themselves differently, not like celebrities, like survivors. They didn't talk about their kills, they talked about the ones they lost, and they welcomed the new guys with a nod. No speeches, no hazing, just a nod that said, "If you make it through today, you'll understand." Because in the air, there was no rank that mattered more than experience. You might be a lieutenant on paper, but if the waist gunner had flown 18 missions and you'd flown 3, you listened to him. And that humility, that quiet understanding between men, it was sacred. It's what held them together when the sky turned black with flak, when fighters swarmed, when one engine died, then another, and the altimeter began to drop. It's what kept them from breaking, because they couldn't break. Not with the crew watching, not with the mission riding on them. There's a reason why even now, 80 years later, bomber crews from World War II are remembered with such reverence. It's not just the danger they faced, it's the way they carried it, with grit, with discipline, with quiet fire. And when VE Day finally came, when the war in Europe ended and the bombers were grounded, something strange happened. Some men wept, some cheered, but many just sat on the tarmac, staring at the sky. Because that sky, that awful, beautiful, violent sky, had taken so much from them. Friends, innocence, sleep. And now it was quiet. One pilot, interviewed decades later, said, "I didn't know what to do when the silence came. I thought I'd be relieved, but I missed the sound of the engines. Not because I liked flying, but because I knew what it meant. It meant we were still fighting, still together." And when the planes were decommissioned, the final crews watched them roll away like funerals on wheels. Some followed their bombers to scrap yards. Some bought small pieces, a panel, a hatch, a wheel. One man bought the nose cone of his B-24 and turned it into a greenhouse in his backyard, because letting go was never easy. Even peace hurt. Peace came with a peculiar silence. For the bomber crews who'd spent years living above the clouds, scanning for fighters, praying through flak storms, gripping controls slick with sweat, the quiet was deafening. They were home, but not the same. Some tried to slip back into normal life. They got jobs, married sweethearts, bought houses with front porches. But behind every Sunday dinner, every workday routine, lay a part of them that had never landed. That part stayed at 25,000 feet. It stayed in the freezing altitude, where oxygen masks iced over and your breath came shallow. It stayed in the moment when the flak burst just 6 feet too low to kill you. It stayed in the silence of a missing wingman's call sign. Some coped by building model planes, others drank. Some never flew again, not even as passengers. They didn't talk about it. Not because they were stoic, but because words couldn't reach that high. The Army Air Forces disbanded in 1947, reborn as the United States Air Force. New planes replaced the old ones. Jet engines, swept wings, pressurized cabins. The B-17s and B-24s, once kings of the sky, were now relics. Some were sold for scrap, others used as training hulks. A few were converted into transport aircraft or dropped into test ranges. But for the men who had flown them, every rivet held meaning. Every throttle lever, every gun turret, every scratched name on the nose. At reunions in the 1950s and 60s, airmen gathered to talk, finally, about the things they couldn't say when it mattered. They spoke of how the bomb bay doors sometimes jammed, of how your ears never stopped ringing after a mission, of how the sky sometimes turned red when a squadron went down at once. One man brought a fragment of flak, still embedded in the flight suit he wore home. Another had his original turret handle mounted on wood. A third had nothing but a photo. 12 men standing in front of the Liberty Bell, all of them smiling. Only 2 of them made it through the war. Their sons asked questions. Their wives pieced together fragments. And slowly, the world began to listen. Movies came, documentaries, books. But even then, the focus often shifted to the planes themselves, the legends of aviation. What got lost were the men, the ones who loaded ammo belts in the dark, bleeding from the ears, the ones who watched their pilots slump over the stick and had to finish the mission without him, the ones who stood in line for breakfast, knowing today might be their last meal, and who still joked about the eggs. That's where Ghosts of World War II comes in. We don't just remember aircraft, we remember airmen. We remember the ones who never made it past their 4th mission, the ones who earned the Distinguished Flying Cross and never mentioned it, the ones who sat at reunions and said nothing, but squeezed your hand with the kind of strength you only get from flying through hell. There's a story from 1963, told quietly among veterans of the 8th Air Force. A retired navigator, now a teacher, went to a high school assembly for Veterans Day. He sat in the back, wearing a plain suit. When the speaker, a local councilman, mentioned the brave bomber crews, he shifted in his chair. Afterward, a student approached him and asked, "Did you fly?" He nodded. The student asked, "Was it scary?" The man looked her in the eyes and said, "I lost 37 friends. We were scared every day, but we kept flying. That's all you need to know." That became the story passed around that school for decades, and across the country, stories like it began surfacing, slowly, quietly, but always with the same message. We flew, we survived, and we remember. In 1999, the Memphis Belle, one of the most famous B-17s of the war, was restored and placed in a museum. Thousands came to see her. Veterans stood beneath her wings and wept, not for the plane, for the crew, for the men who once sat in her belly, sweating, swearing, praying, for the ones who never came back. They didn't cry because they missed the war. They cried because they were finally seen, because finally, someone remembered. The term flying coffins never truly disappeared. It lived on, not as an insult, but as a badge, a dark nickname worn by those who understood its weight, a title that over time turned from mockery to myth, because the men who stepped into those machines, knowing full well what the odds were, didn't flinch, they just flew. And that's what stuck. They weren't invincible. They weren't flashy. They were men of routine, of repetition, of resolve. And it's that very lack of drama that made their courage so pure. There's no glamour in climbing into a plane with frostbitten fingers. There's no spotlight when you sit alone in a turret for 7 hours straight, waiting to fire one shot that might save your crew. There's no victory parade when you make it home after your 25th mission, just paperwork, silence, and a bus ride home. But it mattered, because those missions, flown day after day, week after week, wore down the Nazi war machine like water wears stone. Precision bombing wasn't perfect, but it was relentless, and it sent a message. You can't hide from the sky. Even today, the strategies developed by the 8th Air Force and the 15th Air Force form the backbone of modern aerial warfare. combat box formations, overlapping arcs of defense, high-altitude precision strikes, all of it born from the lessons those coffin crews paid for in blood. When modern pilots fly over hostile territory, they benefit from the ghosts above them, from the mistakes corrected, from the courage modeled, from the paths once flown straight into enemy fire, with no GPS, no drones, no second chances, just a compass, a crew, and trust. There's a museum in Dayton, Ohio, the National Museum of the United States Air Force. Walk through it, and you'll see a B-17 hanging from the ceiling, her nose art still bright, her guns retracted. Kids stare up. Old men stand silent. Some touch the railing with shaking hands. One veteran, during a tour, whispered to his grandson, "That one, she brought me home twice, third time she didn't." And that grandson never forgot. That's how legacy survives, not in speeches, but in whispers passed down through generations. That's what Ghosts of World War II is for, to make sure those whispers don't vanish. Because every time a veteran dies, a library burns. Unless we save the pages. So we tell the stories of the ball turret gunners who climbed into their tiny death pods, knees to their chests, just to protect the tail. Of the bombardiers who squinted through primitive sights, knowing a few degrees meant the difference between a factory and a village. Of the waist gunners who froze their hands to metal grips, never once stepping away even when the oxygen ran low. Of the pilots who landed bombers with one wing, one engine, and no brakes. And of the crews who went down together, choosing death over desertion. Because in those moments, they weren't flying machines. They were flying promises to each other, to the mission, to the belief that what they did, for all its horror, might someday bring peace. And it did. But peace came with a price. The crews came home to a country that was already moving on. Jobs needed filling, families needed rebuilding. There was little time for reflection, no therapy, no debriefs, just silence. Some found purpose, others drifted, but all carried the sky with them. You could tell, in the way they looked at contrails, in the way they paused during thunder, in the way they flinched at fireworks, just for a moment. Because even after 60, 70, 80 years, that kind of sound doesn't leave you. And neither does that kind of bond. One veteran, when asked about the most heroic thing he'd seen in the war, didn't speak for nearly a full minute. Then he said, "My radio operator couldn't swim. Plane went down. I stayed with him. We both went under. Neither of us came up heroes, but we came up together." That's what mattered, not medals, not kill counts, but that bond. That's why today, right now, Ghosts of World War II invites you to carry that legacy. If your grandfather flew in the 8th or 15th Air Force, tell us his name. If your great-uncle served in a bomber squadron, post his unit. If you're just here to honor them, welcome, because you're doing more than watching. You're remembering, and that's how we keep them flying. Time did what war could not. It grounded the bombers, the roaring engines, the blackened skies, the shimmering waves of aluminum across Europe, all became memories, then stories. Then, for too many, just footnotes in dusty textbooks. But not for us, not for you. Because if you've stayed through all 6 sections of this story, then you know what others forgot. You know what flying coffin really meant. It meant stepping into a machine built of rivets and risk, knowing that every second you spent in the air brought you closer to fire, and maybe home, maybe not. It meant walking across a foggy tarmac at 4 a.m., watching your breath crystallize in the dark, loading bombs into a plane named after a girl you'd never see again. It meant trusting 9 other men with your life, not in theory, but in altitude, where your world depended on a single bolt not shearing off, a single hand not hesitating. It meant silence, long silences, where you thought of your mother, your girl, the dinner you missed back in '42, and it meant doing it all again the next day. That kind of sacrifice doesn't vanish. It lingers. In the empty seats of American Legion halls, in the folded flags resting on fireplace mantels, in the grainy black and white photos that still sit on bookshelves, boys frozen in time, grinning beneath their bomber's nose art. And now, it lingers here, with us, with ghosts of World War II. We don't fly the missions, but we keep the memory flying. We fly it through stories, through names spoken aloud, through videos watched by those too young to remember, but wise enough to listen. Because history isn't just what happened. It's what we choose to carry. And this story of the flying coffins is one we must carry with both hands. We carry it when we hear the low drone of a restored B-17 passing overhead on Memorial Day. We carry it when we meet a veteran in line at the grocery store, and he mentions casually, "Yeah, I flew over Germany once." We carry it when we tell our children what courage looks like. Not capes, not applause. Just a 19-year-old kid scared out of his mind, strapping into a bomber he called home because the guy next to him was counting on him. That's courage. And that's what they did. Thousands of them. Mission after mission, loss after loss, fire after fire, until the sky finally gave way to peace. So what do we do now? We say their names. We write them in comments. We watch their stories, and we tell others to do the same. We take 5 minutes from our day to sit with their memory, really sit, and feel the weight of it. Because they carried that weight every day they flew. Now it's our turn. If this story moved you, if it brought back the face of someone you once knew, or introduced you to a name you'll never forget, do something. Comment their name. Say where they flew. Say what they told you, or just say thank you. Because this isn't just a video, it's a mission to remember, to honor, to fly their flag in the only way we can now, by refusing to forget. They mocked the flying coffins until the sky rained hell. But we remember them as they truly were, angels of altitude, wolves of the wind, gentlemen of steel and fire. And when they flew for us all. This is Ghosts of World War II, and the sky still echoes with their names.